up to you. When it's 2019, but it feels like 1933.
Hi, this is the Thursday edition of The Attitude with Arnie Arnesen and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. You know the drill, we record on Wednesday morning, but this is the fourth Thursday of the month. And on the fourth Thursday of the month, we get to hang out with Jonathan Feingold. We teach a class called Race Class. Actually, he teaches it, and I'm a good student. And many, many moons ago, actually January 25th, 2022, Jonathan Feingold, we issued a press release. And here's what that press release said. Legislation restricting the teaching of race and racism in public schools and government entities has spread across the country. But in an effort to respond, Boston University law professor Jonathan Feingold and The Attitude's Arnie Arnesen are offering Race Class, a once-a-month course conversation where listeners can hear what it's like to approach race and racism from a place of curiosity and history rather than fear and anxiety. In describing the foundational purpose of the class, Feingold noted, "We know race matters. Part of this project is to make sense of what that means." Welcome back to the program, Jonathan. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks, Arnie. Always happy to be here.
So we are up to episode 17. Isn't this amazing? We've been doing this together for such a long time. There's so much to talk about, and there's so much history to reflect on. It appears that today's conversation is going to be looking at the issue of racial profiling. And you start out with two data points: the federal lawsuit against Antioch police for their racist texts, the Kansas City shooting where the 84-year-old white man shoots Ralph Yarl, a black kid, for ringing the wrong doorbell. And then, of course, we've seen another number of other shootings, going up the wrong driveway, and it wasn't necessarily a person of color, or going into the wrong car. But what we do know is not only are these things terrifying, but then when you make that simple mistake, especially if you're black, there's a significant likelihood you will be shot. Stand your ground, the castle doctrine, whatever. But now sometimes if you just go up the wrong driveway because everyone is so prepared for someone to attack you, you also can get shot. And what I was telling my audience the other day, Jonathan, was that I was going into the very, very sort of rural part of my state. And I was to pick something up for my daughter. And I had my GPS on, and eventually I couldn't even use my GPS because it was so rural. I get to the driveway where I'm supposed to pick up this thing called a worm farm. And when I get to the driveway, I suddenly realize in this very rural part of my state that the driveway is a split driveway. You can go to the right for one house and go to the left for another house. And I didn't know which driveway I was supposed to take. And all of a sudden, I'm sitting in my car at the base of the driveway going, what if I go up the wrong driveway and the guy that is standing behind the door watching me thinks that I'm there to attack him and decides to shoot me through his door? Okay? This is now a form of profiling that is just so scary. And we think of racial profiling, we always think of the cops, but now we can't think of the cops. Now we have to think of our neighbors. Now we have to think about someone in a car, because too often than not, especially if you are a person of color, your vulnerability is enhanced. I don't even know how many fold. So let's talk a little bit about what is going on with racial profiling. And you asked the question, is racial profiling okay?
The answer is no. Racial profiling is not okay. As we tend to endeavor to do, the goal is, as much as answering the question to try to, as much as answering the question to try to surface the questions that we should be asking, the questions that generally are not present in our national conversations about race and racism, in our community-based conversations, in our classroom conversations. And I think that it is right that in many ways, conversations about racial profiling have focused on the police and the government. But my sense is that many people who have, either anecdotal or personal experience with profiling will tell you that it's never just the police, it's never just the government, it's always private individuals as well, whether it's the store clerk that is just, paying a little bit more attention to someone else, whether it's the neighbor who's looking at you a little bit suspiciously when you're just jogging through the neighborhood. And so it's never just the government. And folks like Khalid Beydoun have written some really important work that ties together the relationship between private acts of profiling and public acts of profiling, which, and maybe we can get Khalid on because he would be a great guest.
That
But
would be
so
great.
for today, and we never have enough time, and so it's going to be a relatively surgical conversation, relatively quick. But here's sort of my goal and my point of departure. My guess is now that in a lot of classrooms, notwithstanding the rise of efforts to restrict conversations about race and racism, but you have a lot of committed teachers and committed students who want to tackle these issues and these topics, including topics like racial profiling. And my anxiety is that unless the teachers and the students are sufficiently prepared to have conversations about topics like this, we're actually not going to have, the conversation is not going to be very productive. And so my goal today, through sort of our standard Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, again, quickly, is just to try to highlight the questions that I think we should be asking. And this is not exhaustive, but it's meant to at least highlight some key questions if we want to have a sophisticated conversation about this thing called racial profiling. We can't just fling around our conclusions, whether or not they're right or wrong. Really, the analysis matters, the questions matter, and it's really key that we surface and expose the assumptions that we're bringing to these conversations. So that's where we're headed. Act 1, we'll focus on the factual questions that we should be asking but often don't. Act 2, we'll be focusing on the values questions we should be asking but often don't. And then for Act 3, if we have time, we're just going to get into the hypocrisy that is sort of the elephant in the room in conversations about racial profiling.
Where you begin is you say there are two standard competing responses about racial profiling. One, no, it's not okay because it's racist. It's based on stereotypes. Or two, yeah, sure, it's okay. It's rational. Stereotypes actually track actual differences across groups. And I think it's really important to almost head that in the back of our heads as we have this conversation and go through this roadmap, because you begin with Act 1, which is the factual assumption. So what do you mean by the factual assumption? What kind of facts are you looking at?
I really appreciate you sort of offering those two competing claims, because I think generally, often when we have conversations about racial profiling, you will hear on one side, profiling is based on racist stereotypes. And another side is often saying, well, but this is rational because those stereotypes actually reflect real world differences. And so someone might say, yeah, like it seems like it would be reasonable to presume that someone who appears to be, of Asian descent, that they're more likely to be not from the US than someone who we would, understand to be white, given historical patterns of racial discrimination in immigration that targeted folks from Asian countries. They're like, that seems rational. Or the person walks into the surgical room at the hospital and they turn to the man as opposed to the woman because, well, look, we know that there has been a history of discrimination against female surgeons. Women are underrepresented in this field, presumably. And so it seems rational that you would, statistically presume it's the man and not the woman. And so there is sort of underlying many defenses of racial profiling is this claim, and it's an empirical claim that the stereotype is accurate. If that's the claim, that claim is generally relying on at least two big assumptions. And here I'm drawing in part on work from one of the sort of friends of the show, Jerry Kong, who about, I guess, 10 years ago or so, co-authored a paper that implicated these conversations a bit. If the claim is stereotypes are rational because they reflect actual demographics, what are the two big assumptions? So the first is that, well, that the stereotypes are accurate. Seems pretty simple. We could rephrase it as our beliefs about the world are correct. The second assumption is that not only do we have accurate facts in our head, but we act rationally based on that information. That is, the facts dictate the behavior. Turns out both of those assumptions are really fraught. And so let's start with the first. Again, are the stereotypes accurate? in part because we have limited time, I'm going to be pretty superficial, but I just want to name 5 reasons why we might be skeptical that the stereotypes are quote unquote accurate. The first, turns out that implicit and explicit biases differ. So what is an implicit bias? What's an explicit bias? An implicit bias is a bias, an association, for instance, between gender and whether or not you think someone is a surgeon, or racial identity and whether you think someone is a citizen.
Right.
So that is measured indirectly through stuff like the implicit association test. An explicit bias, measuring the same association, but through a direct measure. Essentially, you give someone a survey and you say, who's more likely to be the surgeon, man or woman? Who's more likely to be the citizen, person of this race or person of that race? It turns out that implicit measures of racial biases are almost always different than explicit measures. Can't both be right. Okay, so that's just one reason to be skeptical. Second reason, what is the source of the stereotype? So you could say, well, maybe there's some people who actually are spending a whole lot of time digging into the data. We could think separately about whether we should be relying or skeptical of the data. But where do these assumptions we have come from?
Tucker Carlson.
Maybe
Oh,
Tucker.
sorry, I have to go on.
But maybe
going.
Bill Maher, maybe New York Times, maybe
Right.
ABC. But generally, it is through consumption of media.
Right.
Now, do media portrayals accurately represent the world as it is? A whole lot of research suggests no. But generally, we're pretty confident about our assumptions about the stereotypes, even though we haven't actually looked at anything that we would ever consider quote unquote data or quote unquote like actual evidence. So second is just like, well, where does those stereotypes come from? Third, we tend to draw illusory or sort of not real correlations. There's a whole lot of mind science that shows that when we encounter facts that are consistent with our assumptions about the world or stereotypes, we're far more likely to notice those facts, and it also prompts us to overestimate the connection. So for example,
exactly.
If you walk into an airplane and you see a pilot who is male, you notice it. You assume that they are going to be male, and then you just assume, all pilots are male. There's going to be something different that will happen if you notice a pilot, maybe who's a woman, though we'll talk about that a little bit later. Third is illusory correlations. And again, all we're asking now is whether there's a reason to be skeptical of the accuracy of the stereotype. The fourth is motivated reasoning. Turns out, a whole lot of research shows that we exaggerate positive traits about in-groups and exaggerate negative traits about out-groups.
Right.
And so we are essentially motivated reasoners. It is in a sense, hardwired into us to sort of think of the world as a function of in-groups and out-groups, and generally to see positive traits enhance when it's about an in-group and negative traits enhance about an out-group. Relatedly, and this is the fifth, we almost always engage in what you can think of as out-group essentialism. We think of out-groups as monolithic, not really much variance, though with respect to in-groups, we are deeply aware of all the heterogeneity within that group. And you can just think with respect to, the racial category Asian. Literally billions of people in the world who presumably would fall into this category. And how could you have a more heterogeneous group? But as a function of the way in which race operates in the United States, anyone from that group is going to confront different sorts of biases, part of which are essentially flattening the difference across these incredibly varied groups. So again, this is a very quick conversation that is just meant to flag all of the questions that we should be taking seriously in engaging if the claim is racial profiling is rational because the stereotypes are accurate.
Jonathan, I hear all these things, and as I'm trying to unpack what you're saying to me, I keep thinking about, but isn't this sort of the flaw of human nature? that we don't see individuals, we see them in groups, that we tend to make it easier on ourselves, so we tend to embrace the stereotype, that we tend to orient towards the facts that seem to justify our stereotypes or our racism or whatever, saying, see, and therefore we search out those facts and we reinforce those facts. And the idea of being curious, the idea of challenging our thinking, the idea of questioning those things, that is such a difficult thing to do. And it's something that in some ways has almost been discouraged.
There's moments in class when someone will ask a question or make a point, and I will respond. I will say, yeah, but that point you made bridges us to the second assumption. So
Okay.
again, if the claim is that racial profiling is rational, predicated on the notion that the statistics accurately represent the world, accurately reflect the world, the second assumption is that not only do we have accurate numbers in our head, but that we rationally act based on that information. And there's this field called behavioral economics, draws a lot heavily on social psychology, subfields like behavioral law and economics. And the basic upshot is that A, we are terrible at calculating accurate probabilities, even when we might have some accurate numbers in our head. And we are terrible acting rationally, even on those accurate calculations. Because you might, and so like everything you said, Arnie, about sort of human nature is like generally not wrong. But generally, there's also this assumption that, okay, we might hold sort of stereotypic views, or we might know that different groups that, there's differences. But if we're exposed to evidence that counters this stereotype, certainly we wouldn't still engage in a way that's consistent with the stereotype. And the evidence suggests that that's not true. Like if you have people observe two schools that are identical materially, except for cues that reflect the racial identity of the people who inhabit the schools that are like quote unquote whiter get higher ratings than the schools that aren't. If we're suggesting that the stereotype leads to accurate, rational behavior, generally not true. So again, we're moving super fast with a very modest goal, just to surface the questions that we should be asking as a nation, as a community, in our classroom, if we want to actually have a deep, sophisticated conversation about racial profiling. And we're just talking about the factual assumptions. Let's move now to the values questions. So when someone says racial profiling is justified morally because it's based on actual real world differences, implicit in that statement is that the stereotype that the real world differences, it's not that just they're accurate, but they're accurate enough to knowingly expose innocent people to harm.
Yes.
Because if you're engaging in any sort of profiling, it is necessarily over-inclusive. It's over-inclusive by design. That's a function, a feature, not a bug. Because you are targeting people not based on their conduct or the quote-unquote content of their character, you are targeting them based on some trait or racial identity. And so one question, this sort of goes to the hypocrisy that we may or may not have time to get into, is how does racial profiling in any way square with the American ideal of individual treatment? Because it is, by definition, a departure from it. And so here's some questions that we might ask. Again, if the goal is to have a serious conversation about racial profiling. The first would be, well, what are the statistics that are actually necessary to justify profiling? It's real, like people say, like the numbers are there, but what are the numbers that matter? Is it because it could be different things? It could be the base rate, the percentage of a group that engages in the quote unquote bad thing. Right. And so, as a concrete example, think about drunk driving. Imagine that some jurisdiction, instead of checkpoints because they don't want to interfere with everyone, they're just going to target the folks who they think are most likely to be engaging in drunk driving. And assume that there's actually good evidence that it's white men. What is the percentage of white men who engage in drunk driving that warrants this identity-based stop? Must it be 90% of white men, 50%,
Exactly. Oh, God.
10%,
Oh, God.
0.01%, 0.0001%? Like, this is a legitimate question.
Yes.
If we are claiming that the profiling is warranted because some group like is more likely than some other group to like or engages at a higher rate than some other group, well, what is the rate that we're comfortable with to depart from the American ideal of individual treatment?
As I'm listening to you, I keep thinking about the racial profiling of mass murderers.
Yeah.
Okay? I mean, for the most part, they've been white men. For the most part, they've been white men. Now, the question is, as you point out, what's the base rate? Like, how many white men do this? But yet, I mean, again, think about this. If you are going to start talking about racial profiling and you want to prevent mass murders, then you're going to be locking up a lot of white young guys. I mean, because by definition, that we see the result. And the result happens to indicate that. But what is that as a percentage of young white men? Oh my
Yeah,
God.
and so
Oh
like
my
a
God.
different way to ask that question, and we're going to run out of time quickly, so we will
I
have
know.
to continue this conversation another day, but like this is a serious question. Are there groups that are exempt from profiling?
Yes.
Because like you think about with respect to sort of like men in the United States who are racialized as white, how many bad acts would it take, or is there a number of bad acts it would take from this group where we would ever see a policy of profiling white men adopted? Someone might respond and say, yeah, but they're so much of the population, or like, but there's different, like, you shouldn't be so overbroad, like it's a subset of men racialized as white. It's like, okay, well, we can have those conversations. We don't tend to have those conversations when it's other groups. And then like a different answer is like, well, if the answer is no, like if there's no factual scenario in which you can imagine the United States or a jurisdiction in the United States formally engaging in profiling, well, then it sort of like raises like, I guess, many questions. One is like, why do we have different standards for different groups? That seems to
Right.
like be morally problematic. Another just sort of begs the question about what is the function that racial profiling is performing? Because if there's a context where there's a clear harm, just as a matter of our racial common sense, we would never profile there, then racial profiling can't be about protecting us. It can't be about making us safe. It must be doing something else. And whatever the intent is, when racial profiling is invoked as a common sense solution that targets a particular group, what that is signaling to the entire community, the entire country, is that this is a group that we are comfortable treating differently, treating
Yes.
worse,
Yes.
knowingly harming innocent people, not for doing anything wrong, but for being part of a group, because we need to quote unquote protect the quote unquote greater good. But that is suggesting that that group is not part of the greater good.
Oh
It
my
is
God.
signaling that
Yeah.
there's a group that's outside of the center of the country. And if there's a group that we would never put outside, then that tells us something.
Let me just go through these 3 points that you make in your fabulous outline because I want to reemphasize them. How do we decide on the group? Mass shootings by gender? So why aren't we profiling all men? When do we actually require data? Appears that most mass shootings in past century committed by white men. So why are we not profiling white men? And then this kicker. Are certain groups exempt from profiling? White men. If mass shooting every day involving white men, would we ever adopt a policy of profiling white men? If the answer is no, why do we accept racial, religious profiling any other time? Oh my God, Jonathan.
And Arnie, before we jump off, I just want to
Yeah,
add one thing about the hypocrisy, and we don't have time to get into all of this,
yeah.
but so turns out there are states around the country that are prohibiting teachers from engaging certain topics, from promoting certain viewpoints. The hypocrisy is like that all of the attacks on CRT, on anti-racism, comes from this quote unquote colorblind perspective that makes a factual claim that race doesn't matter and a moral claim that because race doesn't matter, we should not distinguish people on the basis of race. Turns out these people are not actually concerned with racial profiling, but the language of many of the statutes could best be read as prohibiting teachers from promoting racial profiling.
And on that note, I need to say goodbye to Jonathan Feingold. He's a professor at Boston University Law School. This is Race Class, episode 17. We need 2 hours. Jonathan Feingold, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Arnie.
This is the Thursday edition of The Attitude with Arnie Arnesen and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. We will schmooze tomorrow, everyone. Ciao.